Hi everyone, I'm Tim Von Rieden from ConceptCookie.com, and in today's tutorial I'm going to be doing something different. I'm going to take you guys through an entire traditional sketch from start to finish. And this has been something that's been requested many times, and yesterday I finally went out and got a webcam, and I will be showing you my entire process. And there's two things that I mainly want to cover in this tutorial. The first is how to create form through contrast, and I think that's something that I rely heavily on rather than trying to have line art define my shapes and forms. And then the second thing, and I'm going to pick up the webcam here, is I'm going to be taking you through this old sketch. I'm going to be recreating it. I'm going to talk about what I've learned since I've created this. And you may recognize this as the tip tutorial I did a few years ago about turning traditional sketches into digital art. And I want to talk about what I've learned since then and kind of go from there. So I'm going to quickly show you guys the pencils that I'll be using, and then let's just go in and jump right into it. Okay, so really quickly, these are the pencils I typically use when I sketch. Now the first one is just a standard mechanical pencil, and that is a 0.7 millimeter lead. And this is something that I've used my entire life. I never saw a problem with them. I actually prefer them over traditional pencils, and I think it's just because you always get that same size lead, and it bothered me when a pencil got worn over time. And this is something that's more personal preference, so I'm not saying this is the right way to go, this is just the way that I prefer to do it. And then over this past year, I've been kind of finding out that you can go smaller with your lead diameter, and the blue one was the first one I got about 8 months ago, which is a 0.5. And you can kind of see the difference between a 0.7 and a 0.5, but it wasn't until I started getting even smaller with these 0.3 millimeters that I could really get details fine-tuned in my drawings. And you can even take this a step further, so there's a 0.1 millimeter, but that one you have to order specifically online. And even this 0.3 was a little harder to find than I thought it would be, where you would think typical stores might carry them, but no, I'd go to a specific art store to find it. So I'm going to be using the 0.5 for the base, and then the 0.3 for a lot of the detailing today. So that's kind of my overview of the pencils I'll be using. And then also, these like rubber erasers are my best friends when it comes to drawing traditionally, where I love that you can form it into a shape if I really need like a pinpoint and then use that as my eraser. It's really great for picking up not only that, but also smudges. If you tend to rub the side of your hand on your paper a lot, this quickly will get it off without having a big struggle of using a smaller eraser. And that's the other thing really quick with these more fine-tuned pencils. You'll notice how the erasers are typically smaller, and that's so that you can get into smaller areas. So I really like that as well. So you can definitely see the difference when I put them side by side. So as I start out, I just want to point out these are general guidelines that I use for concentrated sketching. So these aren't like those quick sketches where you're trying to like rough out an idea. These are closer to something that I know is going to be polished in the long run, so I try to take my time and really go slow with the initial sketching. So when I'm starting out, I try to etch out lines to suggest forms. So I'm not working dark at all, I work really light, and I'm trying to find shapes, or I'm trying to find values that are interesting for me to work with even further. And you can see, especially as I get through the rest of the headpiece, you can see how I lightly etch out outlines of shapes, and then I work with them, and it's the whole process of trying to create a solid foundation to work up on. And I usually don't even do a lot of shading until I get a general basis and it's consistent throughout of what I'm going to be creating, and get kind of a feel to, do I like the composition? Do I like how the forms are working together? And try to work from broad to narrow. And that's not just a traditional tip, but that's just a painting and drawing tip in general. Because when you focus too much on detailing early on, you're really missing out on creating what could be a more solid foundation. And I emphasize that all the time on creating a solid foundation for you to work upon, because that really will help create a better piece in the long run. And also try to keep consistent. So this is something that I've been kind of trying to force myself to use more often, because I hear it and I see how it works. And that's try to keep consistent throughout. So don't try to over detail one area of your piece without trying to kind of bring the rest of the piece up to speed as you go with it. So the reasoning for that is sometimes you get so focused and zoned in on one area of a piece that you're missing the broader spectrum of what you're working on. And you have to keep the entire composition in mind as you're doing a piece like this. And not only like for traditional, so some of these tips do bleed into digital as well, but for this especially, you want to try to keep consistent throughout so that you don't overshade an area. And then as you go throughout, you might be thinking, oh, I kind of want to edit that one area that I spent 2 hours on. So you definitely want to keep consistent. And I never want you guys to feel like something is good enough. I always want you to push yourself even past what you thought you were capable of. And I don't want you to settle for something that is more on the mediocre side, especially if you know you can push yourself further. And if there's something that bothers you in your piece, don't just leave it, fix it. If you can tell that there's something that bothers you, like if the anatomy of a nose is wrong, but you already shaded it, go in and fix it. Don't take the easy route and just be like, well, it's already finished. I don't feel like going back into it. Take the time, and the patience will pay off in the long run. And now here's when I get into more of the detailing and the shading part. So I switched to my .03 pencil, and I'm getting more into like the fine tuning of this feathering. And I love drawing feathers, so for me this is actually kind of relaxing, but it's a lot of repetition. And sometimes the meticulous side of rendering might not seem as fun as doing something quick or sketchy, but it does pay off when you finish the piece, because then when people look at it, they can see the hard work. They can see the time that you put into it. And not only for feathers, but in the way that I shade and in the way that I try to separate forms, I try to do it with contrast rather than using a sharp line. I always loved the look of having two forms butt up against each other without having the need for a line to separate or tell the viewer that this is where this object ends and this is where this object begins. And when I work on something that is organic, so in this case something like feathers, I try to have some form of reference in front of me so I can try to keep it as accurate and depict it as close as possible to what it really looks like. So in this case, I have an actual feather that I was looking at in front of me, and I try to look at the way that the feather breaks in certain areas and the way the stem or the middle part reflects light, and try to depict and recreate that as accurately as possible in my pencil drawing. And know that an eraser tool can be just as powerful as the pencil itself. So don't feel afraid to turn the pencil around and use it to lighten up areas, or even kind of redo areas completely in. Or if you really want, like in this case, in the feathers, that middle line, I really wanted it to be a nice clean look all the way from the beginning of the stem to the end of the feather. So then I just turned my pencil around and really carefully went down the line and tried to erase only down the center. Now you have to be a little precise and have a steady hand, but with practice you can definitely achieve that. Now, while working, you may notice that your hands may get oily or a bit palmy, or what's the other word for it? Clammy. And I try to work with this, but sometimes if it becomes too much, I just go and wash my hands. But sometimes when there's areas that really stand out of being too dark, so I push too hard on the paper, I'll usually just use my fingerprint, push down on the paper lightly, and it picks up the dark area of the line. So it will actually lighten up the area that might be too dark. So every now and then, I know there's probably not one area where I really focus in on it, but you'll see me every now and then like push my finger on the paper, and that's to almost collect the overuse of my pencil in certain areas. But when it becomes too much and you can start to notice it smudging, that's when you should really wash your hands, because they might be a bit too oily at that point. And especially when you start shading, you may notice that the side of your hand might start smearing it. So in that case, if you really need like a protective or a sleeve or something, then you should wear one so that you're not smudging all over the place. Now here, I try to find something that I can depict an accurate circle a little better, because there's areas in my piece where I tend to use circles a lot, but if my circle isn't 100% accurate, I try to make it as close as possible. So I'll find something in my household that represents that size that I'm looking for, and eventually I'll just buy a circle stencil that has a bunch of circles laid out on it. But as of right now, I'll just use what's around me to work in my piece. And then from here on out, it's a lot of shading. So this is kind of like the final, or this isn't the final cleanup, but this is the final render pass. So I'll go through everywhere of all the lines that I kind of etched out, and I'll render them as much as possible. So there's some areas that I'll leave a little more unfinished than others, just to give some more interest to the piece. But in some of my pieces, I'll just fully render everything. But in this case, I'll leave some of the elements unrendered. And really render out the back of the hair, the headpiece. Now, when working with such a mashup of elements, so this is something that I really just enjoy doing. It's very relaxing for me. But when doing it, I always second guess myself on, should this shape go here? Should I add something more here? And try not to overthink sometimes in your pieces. And I have this horrible habit of where I'll overthink to the point of I'm wasting time. And I know that for a lot of you, you might feel the same, where you're not making any progress or you feel like you're just recycling your own skill level. And that's where you need to push yourself out of that comfort zone. But at the same time, if you really know that you're just like flip-flopping on different decisions that doesn't really add anything to the piece, you really should just move forward. And even with this, I got to a point in some areas where I'm like, I just need to move forward and move on to a different section of the piece, and then I can come back to it later. So now this is the final cleanup. So I do what I call a final lap, and I'll work around the edge of my piece, and I'll either clean up the edge or I'll render an area that needs it a little more, and I'll just work my way around. And in this way, you can see how I'm working counterclockwise, and I just touch up on the edges and then I finish it up. So here's the finished line piece that I created, and I hope you guys took away some tips and tricks that maybe will help you guys in your own pieces. And I'm definitely looking forward to doing more traditional studies like this. So stay tuned for those, and let me hear if you want to see something specific or if there's something you want to see traditionally. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.